All right, our next plenary will be moderated by Heidi. Heidi Yip is the head of Sustainable Transition Solutions for Southeast Asia BlackRock. Can we invite her, please, on stage? A round of applause. And also joining her on stage are distinguished speakers. May I invite you to come on stage as well. Thomas Bodlow, Chief Executive Officer, NG Southeast Asia. Emily Chew, Head of Sustainability, GIC. Professor Koo Ting Chai, Director, NUS Cities, and Practice Professor with the College of Design and Engineering, National University of Singapore. All right, I'll pass the time over to our moderator.
Thank you very much. I'm sure none of our speakers need an introduction, especially for our very informed audience here. So I will kick us off right away and lay the foundation for this session. First of all, let me ask the audience to help us with some inputs, right, for a bit of a discussion that we want to start. We'll be using Slido for this. So please pull out your phones and scan the QR code on the screen. And the question, like your help to answer is this, right? What solutions do you want to see in the future, say 2 or 3 years, or maybe even 5 years from now, to help decarbonize real estate? We're a diverse audience here involved in different stages of policy making, planning, R&D, business development for real assets, right? And we want to know what's on your wish list. So let me give you some time to put that in, and while we do that, I'll lay the foundation for this session. The built environment sector comprises buildings and infrastructure, and this sector accounts for about 6% of global GDP. It's also responsible for the employment of over 100 million people globally. And in cities, construction and maintenance have been estimated to be responsible for about 40% of the materials used, 33% of energy demand, and 50% of generated waste. Construction and operation of buildings contribute to about 37% of global GHG emissions, and that's data from 2021. So we hope it's gone down, but we are not really sure yet. Now, decarbonizing the built environment will be a major challenge, but one we urgently need to confront. The thesis of this panel is that there is a lot of room for this sector to improve on its emissions profile. And we want to discuss both the challenges as well as the opportunities that businesses face in greening our built environment. So here I'll pause for a while and we can take a look at the responses that have come in. For the speakers, it's either behind you or on the screen in front here. So we see quite a few ideas coming through on green materials, and these are mostly opportunities, right? Renewable energy, focusing on nature-based solutions, more livable cities, but also some interesting ones that look at multiple players, like peer-to-peer trading across buildings, scaling up circular economy solutions. Quite a good range. Let us warehouse these ideas, and we'll see during the course of our conversation today if our panelists can speak to some of the solutions that have been brought up. Right. And as the discussion gets underway, please feel free to pop in your questions or comments on Slido so that we can pull them up during the Q&A. Now I'll turn to the speakers now to get your thoughts. Right. I'll start with in this order from Prof. Koo. Prof. Koo, you have run major public institutions as well as private organizations involved in developing and operating urban infrastructure, including URA, PUB, PSA Corporation, Maple Tree Investments, etc. What are your thoughts on some of the ideas our audience have put on their wish list? And also, can you tell us about some of the more innovative ideas and designs you have seen, which can move the needle on decarbonizing the built environment?
Okay, there's a lot of questions rolled in one. I'm not sure I can answer all of them satisfactorily in the first few minutes, but let me just kind of congratulate CapitaLand and Eco-Business for the theme of this conference this morning, Cities Possibilities. Cities, I think, is close to all of our hearts because we are a city-state, and as you mentioned, 75% of emissions come from cities. But cities, why are cities cities? I mean, somebody said, Jessica, right? Cities occupy only 10% of the land. So actually, when you think about it, cities are actually extremely efficient, and they're also extremely innovative, and they attract people because they are the places where there's opportunity, right? So I think I think, bear in mind there's a dark side and a bright side to cities, and I like to look at the bright side, right? So let me just make 3 points, which might not answer all the questions you asked, but somebody asked me to think about applying the systems approach to making our cities livable, sustainable, and resilient, something that I think, Singapore does almost intuitively now. But, as the head of the Center for Livable Cities last 10 years before I joined NUS, we spent a lot of time to try and document what is it that has made Singapore work, right? 6 million on a little island. We are, frankly, not atypical, right? A lot of people say, oh, we are atypical. But when you look at all cities in the world are striving to achieve many, many things, right? On little pieces of land, right? Real estate is a challenge in every single city, and we are just an extreme example for that. So we kind of concluded that the urban systems approach, and by that CLC distilled it into what they call a livability framework. And the livability framework basically says that if you want to achieve good outcomes for a city, like good quality of life, sustainable environment, and have a competitive economy, then what is really underlying it, the essence of it, to make sure that continues, is really governance and planning, or we call it dynamic urban governance and integrated planning development. Big words, but the principles are actually very simple and I think very applicable to almost every city. But of course, doesn't always happen. Many cities do it well, but many cities don't quite get it right. So to me, at the end of the day, it's not just about climate change. It's not just about low carbon. It's really about how we bring in the economic, the environmental, and the social outcomes to achieve for a city, that is the livability, the sustainability, and the resilience, right? So for Singapore, we have kind of continued to apply this approach, and you have seen it in our Green Plan, right? The Green Plan, you look at it, it sounds like a very simple document, but I can tell you that, I was involved a little bit in it, in my last few years in government, but it requires the work of many, many, many ministries, many, many agencies, fighting, discussing, because everyone wants his share or her share of the pie, right? HDB wants housing, NParks wants greenery, PUB wants water. How do you fight for all these objectives on a little piece of on an island like small as Singapore? And that's where innovations come in. I heard someone talk about ABC Waters, and I was glad she said it's a low-tech solution, because you don't need high-tech solution, but an ABC Waters solution where you bring engineering and ecology together is really a great example of systems thinking and systems approach that deploys new science and new methods. Maybe not very new science, but certainly new methods. Because to teach engineers in PUB, for example, how to calculate the flood resilience of a stream that runs through a park, when we first suggested it to them, my PUB engineers kind of, this guy must be crazy, right? This is something that we have not been taught in school, right? But this is what nature has done. So now they call it nature-based solution. But it's that kind of innovation that I think cities are capable of, provided you have the right governance framework and planning framework. Now, my second point is, and I'm glad when we had the word cloud thing earlier on, that a lot of people said that climate adaptation is important. So my second point is that we need to go beyond just low carbon and start preparing to adapt ourselves to climate change. It's really happening. The world is warmer, we are getting more floods, droughts, and fires. And in Singapore, we were alerted in 2019 by our then Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, of our vulnerability, to rising sea level, to floods, to droughts, and heat as an island in the equator. And then he actually signaled that a whole of society approach is needed to adapt, and he likened it to our defense strategy. So he called it climate defense, right? And then he said, as Singapore, we will commit $100 billion to that. So a lot of the climate change impacts, when you think about it, are due to water, or as is put in the report that I'll mention, instability in the global hydrologic cycle, right? if you want to know what that means, refer to a report that was just launched 2 weeks ago, a report, a commission, right, a global commission of the economics of water that was set up 2 years ago. Our President Tharman is one of the 4 co-chairs, and they recently launched a report that made recommendations of what countries and cities ought to be doing to adapt better to climate. And to me, it's really a milestone report that requires a drastic change in the way we look at climate adaptation. So a lot of action is needed. The report recommended some specific actions. And I'm glad that in Singapore, the Singapore International Foundation, the CEO, Corina Chan, is here, I think, has initiated the Southeast Asian Partners for Adaptation to Water, CPAW. And it's a kind of a multilateral platform to get companies and other organizations, NGOs, to come together to see in what way we could implement some of the recommendations of the GCEW in Southeast Asia. Right? I'm the chair of the CPAW, so we are, I think, actively recruiting to get people to come on board in this platform, and I think CapitaLand is already on board or will be on board shortly, I think. My third point, and this is what I have to speak to coming from the university, is knowledge sharing. And I think that's a key to create awareness and to spur changes in governance and to find innovative solutions. And we have to build capacity for the generations to come. So this is where forums like this are very critical. Platforms like the C40, the CLC's World City Summit, the Urban Land Institute, CapitaLand is an active corporate member, where we bring experts and communities and companies and governments together to share ideas and solutions, right? So universities play a very important role given our role in education and in research. NUS has taken the lead by, we have a sustainability strategy to be net zero by the year 2030. We've demonstrated it with buildings like SDE 1, 3, and 4. Some of you may have seen positive energy buildings. NUS has set up NUS Cities, of which I'm the director. And the idea is that we need to no one is actually trained in cities. All of us are trained as civil engineers, architects, real estate people, lawyers, but who are trained to manage the complex problems of cities. So we thought that being a university based in Singapore, a city-state where some of the most innovative solutions are, we should set up a multidisciplinary platform, right? So we have been operating for the last 2 or 3 years. I think we've trained about 4,000 students now in a course we call Livable Cities. We are graduating at the undergraduate level, students who are minor in cities. We are having a postgrad program and a executive program. And then at the research level, I think all of you know and are working with NUS. I think we have lots of research centers, being a very diverse, comprehensive university. Centers in water and environment, coastal protection and flood resilience, energy studies, sustainable finance, etc., right? So we do have a wide range of expertise that we are trying to build on, right? I think all this final summary, all this I think puts Singapore in a very strong position, I think, to be a climate solutions hub, right, in various areas. And I think somebody mentioned COP29 and Azerbaijan. I think that's where Singapore will have a pavilion, and I think a lot of us will be participating, whether directly or your companies or organizations will be there. To pitch for Singapore as the place where perhaps we can find solutions to some of the issues that we face. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Prof. Khoo. I gave you a lot to chew on, and you definitely did expound on that a lot for us to think about. I wanted to follow up on your point about how when we talk about the risks and opportunities around decarbonisation and climate change, we also need to think really long term, right, about adaptation. And having a supportive regulatory policy and planning environment with long-term thinkers in place really helps to facilitate that. Right? And here I want to move to Emily. in your work for GIC as a very long-term investor, I think that lens of planning for the long term and making sure that future risks are anticipated and managed in advance, right, is quite important. Could you shed some light about how GIC manages its transition risks and opportunities in its portfolio for real assets? I know we started the discussion a little bit about adaptation as well, but for now, let's focus on transition risk, and then we can come back to the adaptation question later.
Thanks for the question, Heidi. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Ecobusiness and CapitaLand for putting together such a great event. So yes, sustainable investing is one of the 5 strategic enterprise priorities for the GIC as of a few years ago, and we've been on a journey to incorporate sustainability risks and opportunities into the way that we invest through policy infrastructure, through engagement with investment teams for several years now. And one of the most enthusiastic partners that we have internally is the Real Assets Group, because many of these issues are existential. They're kind of potentially directly affecting valuations, and there's a lot of concern to make sure that we're monitoring for potential stranding of assets and making sure that that's managed appropriately across appropriate time horizons, because yes, we have a very long-term time horizon, obviously, managing Singapore's reserves, and we measure and report our performance on a 20-year time horizon, which I think is relatively unique among asset management firms. So in terms of how we think about managing the low carbon transition in our portfolio, I'd say we have I'll offer a top-down and a bottom-up perspective. From the top-down perspective, we carry out portfolio-wide assessments and analysis using carbon price stress testing that allows us to stress test the performance of assets if regulation was to incorporate a clearer carbon price in different jurisdictions. And I should add that our real estate portfolio is very global, so not just subject to the carbon tax regime here in Singapore, but very, very global and highly exposed to cities in terms of our real estate, and very much across all different types of real estate asset classes. And we also conduct physical risk analysis of our invested assets, and this involves determining what the physical risks are and then using geolocation data to essentially plot the most exposed assets. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the panel. So from the top down, we're kind of scanning across, particularly looking at it from a risk lens to understand which assets to spend more time with around their potential kind of looking at adaptation measures, looking at valuations. And then from the bottom up, for our most important assets, we are tracking sustainability metrics and looking for opportunities to improve where that is commercial and where that can be value adding to our total portfolio. So one example of how we've invested in an asset enhancement initiatives in portfolio assets is our joint venture with British Land. We started this joint venture in 2014 when we acquired a stake in Broadgate Estate, and we advised British Land on the evaluation of new developments, and that resulted in 2020 delivering our first net zero carbon building at 100 Liverpool Street in London. So how it kind of got all the certifications, BRIM, Platinum, etc. And I think some of the things that's interesting, some of the things that are on the word cloud features of this building. So it is 50% of the existing structure was retained and reused, and then we optimized the building's operational efficiency using smart systems to monitor real-time building performance. There were water recycling systems, rainwater, grey water capture to meet 40% of the water demand, and 100% of the electricity and gas will be supplied by renewable sources. And residential emissions were offset through nature-based solutions. By purchasing of credits in different countries around the world. So kind of an interesting multi-pronged approach of how sustainability metrics are used to make a building net zero. And I think there's probably an understanding that it needs to be a multi-pronged approach. It's not just going to be one initiative. And the final thing that I would add is that we're also thinking about capture of real assets decarbonisation opportunities in the value chain. as well. And that affects not just the asset classes that are in real assets, so real estate and infrastructure, but also some private equity group. So a couple of examples of how we think about investing in what are the decarbonisation technologies required for the real asset sector. I think we categorise them in two ways. One is innovations that support the reduction of embodied carbon. So that's the materials that are going into the buildings to reduce the life cycle carbon footprint. So that's concrete, steel, insulation, for example. And then the second category is technologies that decarbonise the operations of a real asset. So that's the emissions caused through use of the asset. So I mentioned that this can involve investments in technologies that are in other asset departments. So we have established across GIC some dedicated climate opportunities and climate transition portfolios across the public equities division, the fixed income division, and the private equity division. So it really gives us the opportunity to really hone in on this decarbonisation theme and identify, the listed REITs and the kind of prop tech technologies and the bond issuances that are going to help with this decarbonisation push across real assets. So a couple of examples of how we've invested in these two different types of technologies. So when we think about embodied carbon, one of the kind of major building materials in the world is steel, and 75% of the world's steel stock is still today produced by coal consumption. So the adoption of kind of green steel, where you've essentially produced steel through a decarbonised process, renewable energy or hydrogen is really critical to decarbonisation of the embodied carbon in the built environment. So we took an investment in a company called Stegra, formerly known as H2 Green Steel, which is kind of replacing the plants, coal-based plants in the production process with hydrogen. And the green steel is produced on-site with Europe's largest electrolyzer facility. So next generation technology and digitalization and circularity and recycling will make the steel plant the first of its kind and produce steel with 95% less of a carbon footprint. So we're very excited about the potential for this technology to be kind of game-changing in the life cycle of infrastructure. And then on the second category around technologies to decarbonize real assets, operational carbon, we invested in a company called TChem, which is one of the largest digital energy service platforms in the real assets industry. We're active in 18 countries and services more than 13 million dwellings. And this is really supporting the property sector and private landlords to improve their energy efficiency through metering, measuring costs and tracking, etc. That's an example of how you can actually be quite creative and invest in decarbonised real assets across the asset value chain.
Wonderful. That gives us a lot of really good color, which I think sets the stage for Thomas. What you mentioned about the multi-pronged approach and looking up and down the value chain to see where the opportunities are, I think applies very much to NG. Right? It's a major energy player. It provides a range of energy services, but also advisory solutions. So Thomas, in your engagements with owners of buildings and infrastructure, what trends have you observed in terms of the demand for low carbon solutions?
Thanks, and Heidi. A very good morning to all. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. So I would say maybe with regards to the little Q&A you had running a bit earlier, I didn't see the word energy, but it's a very, very important component of the carbon footprint of buildings.
Renewable energy that pop up.
It was there, okay. It's quite critical because the carbon footprint of a real estate asset is significantly majorly driven by its run life cycle, more than the build part. And in that run, the energy component is a very big ticket items. Specifically in this part of the world, it's air conditioning and cooling that drives the demand. So in this context, obviously, we're trying to address, as a partner, this carbon footprint related to cooling. But this happens, you're right, in a market context where real trends appear. The tenants of our clients are asking for more low carbon facilities, more certification. And as a result, there is a pressure put on our real estate partner to act, either to build at the best norms in terms of efficiency, as low carbon as possible, new buildings, or to enter into retrofitting and adaptation of their existing buildings. So there is a pressure from end user, from market. The regulation is coming to more maturity, and I think here, as Professor alluded to, in Singapore, a lot has been done with the Singapore 2030 plan to start with, but also with the evolution of regulations such as Green Mark, which are really driving change. So our approach in this context is to really help our partner de-risk the transition towards a lower carbon footprint for their energy use. And to do that, really, we try to have a holistic analysis of the energy use of our real estate facility partner. We try to embed as much as possible technologies that will help produce with the less energy possible the air conditioning, to distribute it as efficiently as possible in buildings. And already by combining those two approaches, the production and the use, you can have tremendous impact. If I take for reference the project we have embarked on with CapitaLand for Plaza Singapura in Singapore, we started with a good, efficient base, and by reimagining and upgrading all those systems to produce and distribute air conditioning, we managed to cut the energy consumption for the building by 30%. It's quite huge, and we're starting from a Singapore base, which is by far more advanced than what you can find somewhere else in the region. So when you tackle less efficient buildings, the leverage you can bring is quite massive. So having a holistic approach, trying to reduce energy use to the maximum is our main response to these new market demands. But obviously, once you have reduced the energy need to their minimum, you need to tackle the balance, and the balance needs to be as green, as renewable as possible. And here is the same. We're taking a holistic view that depends on the market specificities. There are things you can do very flexibly in Singapore. For example, you can produce on-site, off-site, aggregate the production of a number of assets and package it to supply with renewable energy your customer. This flexibility, unfortunately, is not always possible yet, I think, in other parts of the region. But the great thing is that market forces are pushing progressively all countries to upgrade their regulation and to go towards more flexibility. So that's very, very positive. So from a real estate market demand, there is a trend, there is an expectation from the end user, from the developer, and at the back of that, there is also a positive trend happening at country level on the energy market regulation side. So it's an interesting moment, and the opportunities are quite huge.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just pause here and remind the audience that there is a QR code on Slido for you to enter your questions for the Q&A segment. So please start doing that. And then while I think the audience is getting warmed up with your questions for the speakers, I wanted to talk about, moving a little bit beyond, these incredible opportunities that we talked about decarbonizing the built environment, right? We also need, as Prof. Koo mentioned, to consider the risks that businesses are already facing in terms of changing, physical climate and the impact it's having on our buildings and the cities that we live in. Maybe I'll turn to Emily here, right, to share with us, how you think we can adapt our infrastructure to be more resilient to such risks, and how GIC in particular is managing physical risk in its portfolio, and in terms of investment teams cementing your deals, like how do they go about incorporating the physical risk element into those considerations now?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. So we have a lot of conviction that physical risk is not some future kind of long-dated risk. It's clear and present now. So we're highly motivated to be looking at this issue as we're doing deals and then as part of our ongoing monitoring of the portfolio. Really challenging to find data sources that we think are fit for purpose. But with that said, even though there might not be perfect data sets, we just have to move forward with using the best available for the time being. So I'll talk about this again from a top-down and bottom-up perspective. So from a top-down perspective, we are using hazard mapping data, which is layers of different extreme weather and chronic weather pattern hazards across, the map of the world, and then you're able to map your geolocations of every asset to at least identify the sites that are at higher risk of maybe more hazards or more extreme hazards. With that said, the data set's still limited. In terms of it doesn't predict the frequency or the severity of the hazards. We just know that there will be more in this particular area. What that does is at least gives us the ability to look across the portfolio and then really focus in on the areas of highest risk, to identify where we may need to start to build a transition plan, or a resilience plan rather, for assets that may need investment. The data sets themselves don't give you, they give you a value at risk number which is based purely on the risk exposure, but they don't give you a number that's based on the adaptation or the resilience that's already built into that particular physical structure, or frankly the resilience strategy of the area. So one of the things that we're grappling with is the fact that you can make your building as resilient as possible, dealing with greater number of overly hot days, or even the risk of flooding or storm surge. But if the area hasn't fully made, like as Prof. Koo mentioned, the need for much more coordinated policy and research and action around how to make entire areas resilient. The value you can invest in those resiliency measures for that one building, but it won't necessarily yield benefit if there isn't a coordinated approach. So we really grapple with that and struggle with that at the moment, but we're looking at it actively. And then from a bottom-up perspective, we do evaluate specific assets to determine, as part of the deal process, to determine if physical risks are mitigated, through structural reinforcements or location-specific adaptation. We have used qualified surveyors and engineers on the ground to review assets, to verify their condition and determine if additional measures are required and what the cost of those measures would be, and building that into the valuation. And we've done that particularly for assets with high coastal flooding risks. Now, we've recently done some work in collaboration with S&P, which did highlight that of all of the chronic and acute weather patterns that are producing risk for investors, that it's actually chronic heat waves that is the most widespread. It might not necessarily be the most costly, but it's the most commonly experienced chronic weather pattern that will ramp up in the years between now and 2050. And then beyond 2050, you see an escalation in all of the impact of these physical risks. One of the challenges we have is that between now and 2050, our research with S&P suggests that there's potential value at risk just in the real estate sector of north of 500 billion. But actually, it's much more than that once you get past 2050. Obviously, very hard right now for us to make investments that kind of go to 2100. So it's but by watching it and by monitoring it, it allows us to essentially identify when is the right time to strike with our resilience measures. The other thing that we looked at with S&P recently in this paper that we published was the value of potential climate adaptation opportunities. So again, with every risk, there's an opportunity. And we identified, if you just look at some known technologies in the building sector around cooling roofs and wet and dry roofs that make buildings more resilient to chronic and acute weather patterns, there could be an incremental investment opportunity of $29 billion a year already between now and 2050. So this is, we're kind of going to be advancing more work around climate adaptation to understand where can we position portfolios not only to manage the risk, but also hopefully facilitate the adaptation and take up the opportunity presented by the adaptation.
Thank you. Seeing a lot of questions come in, I do have some more questions myself for the panelists. So actually, I wanted to weave in some of this, into what I am going to pose to Thomas. Really wanted to understand from your perspective as an energy giant, right? How do you already think about managing the physical risk that your infrastructure portfolio might be exposed to, and how are you advising your clients to deal with similar types of risks, right? And I think the audience has asked about the impact specifically on Singapore's ecosystem being subject to greater physical risks. Like, is that something that your clients in this region have also asked for advisory help about? And how does that differ in Singapore versus other markets that you operate in?
Lots of questions. Okay, we have sense what type of risk climate change will make us confront in the future throughout the COVID period. So very simply, it all revolves around availability of power, price volatility, and so we have seen firsthand what the future will look like. So there is a real opportunity, though, a transition opportunity on how the energy markets are being structured as we go along. We are exiting a world, it's been at play for a few years now, but we are exiting a world with big centralized power generation system and use at the downstream. We are moving towards a more decentralized system with a lot of varied energy sources that combine both very large production units leveraging on different technologies such as solar, hydro, wind, complemented by battery storage. So that's on the upstream part, but also more and more on the downstream part. Buildings are becoming energy producer with their own on-site solar system, for example, and they are becoming player on the energy grid as they store, and they are able to become an adjustment variable on the energy system. So if you combine all of these different energy sources, and if you have the right flexibility in the way you can run your portfolio, then you become much more resilient. You become quite certain that anywhere you're able to produce energy, you become much more in control of the cost, the average cost of your produced energy. And that's true for even the single building user that are implementing on-site energy production system and smart solutions to control better their energy use. And so basically by accelerating on the energy transition, you help de-risk the overall system. I think on that front, probably Singapore is again more advanced than other geographies in Southeast Asia for many reasons. I think the Singapore 2030 plan has been helping with very clear direction, very clear guidelines on where the new norms in terms of energy efficiency would go forward, and that allows investors, that allows players in the market to anticipate, to invest in the right direction. But as well, as I was referring to a bit earlier, the flexibility that exists on the regulation for energy system allows to implement a lot of very innovative and flexible business models. So Singapore is quite ahead, is quite a good, I think, inspiration for other countries in the region to de-risk their energy transition. And again, if you do things right, you become more resilient, you are sure that energy is available and less costly. And obviously, if you look a bit further, in countries like America or in Europe, you can see at play as well this the benefits coming from integration of multiple energy sources, both centralized and decentralized. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think there are a number of questions here about, bridging the very different interests and also time horizons of investors, regulators, working with different types of risks. And so on that theme, I wanted to come back to Prof. Khoo and really tap your brains on how you see some of the work you've encountered and your experiences in different countries, the solutions they've put in place, how you see that becoming applicable to helping us in Singapore and Asia manage what potentially could be rising risks from having to decarbonize at the same time as build up environmental resilience.
Okay, big question, and maybe I'll just give a couple of examples, and hopefully that helps to illustrate. When I was in PUB, Orchard Road became Orchard River. Some of you might be old enough to remember that, because that was really the beginning warnings of climate change and how intense rain, even for all, the engineering that we did to try and make Singapore very, very flood resilient, Orchard Road still got flooded on a very rainy day. And that's because Stamford Canal, exceeded its capacity, it overflowed. Fortunately, and this is where I think governance is so important, fortunately, a lot of the kind of policies, so someone talked about robust policy framework, that we put in place in the 70s ensured that many of the buildings did not get flooded, the car parks especially, because PUB put in a policy that to get to your basement car park, which is low, you got to have a hump, right? So that hump must exceed the last recorded flood level. So most of the buildings in Orchard Road were actually quite well protected because they followed that rule. But the few buildings did not, maybe because they were older and they were built before the rule came about, and then they got flooded, and of course all that made headlines, right? So since then, of course, in terms of adaptation, in terms of what we do, right, with the new challenge, I think the data has proven that this is likely to continue to be a trend, that we are going to get more intense rain, more flooding in urban areas. We now have a big detention pond to capture the stormwater at the Botanic Gardens, even before it flows down to Orchard Road. And then there's also a diversion canal that captures the water and diverts it to Singapore River. So these are the kind of solutions that you need. In Singapore, we are lucky that the government kind of is able to pay for it. But when you think about other countries and other cities, how would they, number one, have the knowledge to kind of try and find this kind of solutions, which are systems-wide, and then find the money to be able to pay for it. And I don't have the answer. I think there's a lot of smart people here about financing, but you need to find mechanism, because these are the kind of solutions that's needed in Jakarta, in Bangkok, in many cities in Asia. Yeah. So I maybe I stop there.
Thank you. I think that's quite interesting, the very concrete example you gave of flood protection. I mean, having a government that can plan ahead or respond adequately to the risks as they arise and deal with that for future purposes, I think is super important. I wanted to turn to the audience questions now. We have a few minutes. and maybe pose to anyone on the panel who's prepared to address this, right? This was the one about circularity, right? Should there be more legislation around the tearing down of buildings, with the industry instead pushing for asset reuse through upgrades, AEI, etc. Right? I think this one, this question kind of brings together this idea that it's not just a risk that we're facing in terms of carbon pricing or the need for transition, but it also provides an opportunity. So would anybody like to take this?
I can say a word on good infrastructures, circular infrastructure to supply cooling in the region, which are named district cooling. It's a quite efficient way to service an entire area with one infrastructure. It's quite resilient. It's if you do it well, it's cheaper, and it leads to a lower carbon footprint, and so arguably it's a great solution. It also helps reduce the temperature within the city it serves by a couple of degrees, which in Singapore can make a huge difference in a few years from now. So then the question could be, why don't we develop it at scale on existing part of the city? Singapore is doing a very good job to make sure that district cooling is embedded in the design of all new areas. Punggol, for example, which is going live progressively, is equipped with a district cooling. But if you look at legacy development, like all the ones along Orchard Road, it's been proven extremely complex to convince one-by-one buildings to develop such shared infrastructure. So here I think beyond private developers' interest to make savings and go with lower carbon footprint, a little nudge from authorities, not only from Singapore, but across the world, can make a huge difference. We had the same challenge in Paris years ago, where the deployment of district cooling was kind of pushed between local authorities and private developers. And 30 years down the line, we have deployed one of the largest district cooling in the world, named Climespace. It serves very iconic buildings like the Louvre or the Galeries Lafayette, who everybody must know around here. And we have proven that even in very old complexities like Paris, this type of infrastructure can be developed. So it's just one example, but I think it illustrates very well that there is a very big room to play from the local authorities to push adoption of circular infrastructure across brownfield developments.
Well, since this is a policy question, I can answer this. I think for Singapore, the challenge is small island, little land. So a lot of the policies have been biased towards tearing down buildings, increasing density. But on the other hand, since the 80s, we realized that by demolishing everything, you lose your history, you lose your heritage, and that's why we put in incentives to conserve. So on the one hand, you have incentives to conserve. On the other hand, you have incentives to rebuild. That's why en bloc is very popular. People make windfalls out of that, right? Including many developers. Conservation, not so popular, except for people who sense history and so on. But now there's a new element. So the new element is carbon, right? So if you can retain buildings, not just for the history, but for the carbon that you are no longer emitting, I think that's something that I think the policymakers are really thinking very hard about. How can we shift the policy needle so that we can, encourage a bit more conservation and asset reuse?
Yeah, that syncs very well with one of the other questions about decarbonizing being easier for new builds, but how do you actually inject the technology and the solutions available today to help decarbonize legacy assets? Does anybody have a view on that?
Can I just continue? Promise I'll be short. I mentioned the 3 buildings in NUS campus, right? SD 1, 3, and 4. SD 4 is a completely new building, but they professors applied all the principles of how do you create a net zero building, solar panels, but also passive design features, etc. Right? A complete systems approach. The principles that we learned from building that building were applied to two very old buildings that were built in the 70s when NUS Cambridge was first built, SD 1 and 3, the building I'm in now. So they applied the same principle, did some facade restoration, improvement, put in solar panels, but basically the bones and the foundation remain the same. So it can be done. We've demonstrated it can be done at least for university buildings, but I think the same principles can also be applied to commercial buildings. Yeah.
It's really challenging. Decarbonising existing building stock tends to be expensive. And, that's why I think, so we have an engineering team that sits within our asset management department of the real estate group, and they have the expertise to understand all of the different interventions and to cost them out. And oftentimes it's not yet commercial. And I think having carbon pricing, having regulatory incentives to decarbonise existing building stock is really important for investors to move faster on decarbonising the existing stock. But you don't know what it costs unless you're tracking it. So I think that's at least the step that we've taken. And we also are looking at essentially the price at which, the carbon price at which different decarbonisation technologies, not just for real assets, but in general, become commercial. Because actually the majority of decarbonisation technologies are not yet commercial. Obviously there are some that really are, they're lower than the incumbent in terms of cost structure, so you've got higher profit margin. Some are on parity, and there's a number of experimental technologies that are still without a higher carbon price and without more efficient kind of technology adoption cycle, still not quite yet commercial, unfortunately. So just tracking that and knowing what's in your toolkit is what we're trying to do to be able to move at the right time to decarbonize building stock.
Makes sense. Thomas?
I would just maybe caveat that on the energy front, you have existing mature technologies that can make a huge difference. So I was referring a bit earlier to the work we are doing with CapitaLand on Plaza Singapura. Cooling as a service when applied to a commercial building in the Philippines, for example, it can lead to 60, I've even seen 70% energy reduction for the building. So if you do it right with a private player like ENGIE fronting the initial investment, it ends up being less expensive to run the building once the third-party player has implemented its solution. Of course, it's not applicable in all the countries, and you have to take care about the design and the run risk, but we are very, very comfortable to take that risk for our clients. And as with the balanced power supply to the building, when there is available space on-site or off-site to go with production of solar energy, today, solar offers incredible discounts, and it's almost a no-brainer for people to employ every available space on their rooftop or their premises to put solar. Really, it drives amazing discounts in energy price. Of course, you need a balancing energy, and there are a lot of work to be done to complement what is brought with solar energy. But we can start by the 80-20 today, and there is already a lot that can be done. So we are advocating to start today and as big as possible with our partners on all their existing portfolio.
Yeah, and on that hopeful note, I want to say thank you for all of you for your attention this morning. I know we've overrun a little bit, but I hope you agree with me that our speakers absolutely nailed it in answering that question about the risks and opportunities of decarbonizing the built environment. Please put your hands together to help me thank them.